The GM in Quinn the GM might not stand for what you think it stands for. It's not Grand Maester, it's not George Martin, and it's not even Grandmother. It's Game Master. When I created this channel, I was intending to make videos about Dungeons and Dragons, and I did so for about the first year that I had it. However, when House of the Dragon was airing, I made one video about my favorite Targaryen king and why I loved him so much. And that did really well, and since then I've just spent my time talking about my favorite book series, and it's been a ton of fun. This really helps grow the channel in ways that I really didn't anticipate. But today I'm blending the initial intentions of this channel with its current outlook. I'm blending my favorite tabletop role-playing game with my favorite book series. And to do that, I'm going to be giving each a Song of Ice and Fire point of view characters a D&D class. The class of any D&D character is essentially something that dictates their capabilities, what they can do in the game. It often determines a lot of their personality traits and characteristics, and there are often archetypes that fall under each of these classes. So today I'm going to be assigning one of those classes to each of the 24 point of view characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, and going through my reasoning as to why I've assigned each of them. As both are kind of very fantasy, and I thought it'd be fun to do, as it's just fun to talk about both of these things, and I figured it'd be a good way to celebrate the late 100th video of this channel. This was initially intended as that video, but the scripting process took a little longer than I thought. So be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy this. And yeah, let's jump into the characters, starting with the one and only protagonist of the first book. Ned Stark might be the easiest character to assign on this list. I think Ned Stark is a fighter, and a champion fighter at that. For those who don't know, fighter is the kind of standard warrior class. It's not very specific in what it does, it's just a dude with a sword who can swing the sword and try to kill things. I think that the reason this fits particularly well for Ned is not because he's that great of a combatant, but rather that he's not very good at the other aspects of the game, either the Game of Thrones or the game of D&D. Fighters are known for not really having anything to do outside of combat, and this very much corresponds with Ned's kind of ineptitude in King's Landing throughout the first book and season of Game of Thrones. So overall, I think that that very much could be a good way to think about it. Plus, champion fighters are kind of the stereotypical first player character class that people will take when they're starting the game, and I think that that being the class of the protagonist of the first book in the series is a great kind of connection as well. Catelyn Tully. I'd say she starts out with levels in Rogue, given her attempted secrecy with certain political dealings. However, once she's revived as Lady Stoneheart, I think the Cat is fully an Oath of Vengeance paladin. She's driven purely by a desire for justice and the kiss of life provided by the Red God. Paladins are these holy warriors who are driven by the oath they make to a given deity or otherworldly entity of some sort, and they gain this great power through this divine source. And that kind of ties into the revival from death given by Beric Dondarrion. It helps that this is my favorite class and subclass in Dungeons and Dragons, as my longest running character not only was this class, but also is the subject of what is, I think, my worst performing video of all time. So, big fan of this class. Tyrion was a difficult one. My main issue in making this video is that there really isn't a D&D class focused around being a politician. That said, I think a bard of some sort fits Tyrion quite well, as they tend to focus on quick wits and persuasion, at least the way I typically see them played. The College of Lore could work well here, as Tyrion is incredibly knowledgeable in a wide variety of subject areas. For example, the notes on dragons that he provides to Jon Connington and Aegon. Overall, this idea of a very strong orator who is also very knowledgeable does fit the imp very well. For Daenerys Targaryen, I think she's a fairly new subclass in D&D 5e, that being the Drake Warden Ranger. This is a ranger who has a dragon for a pet, for fairly self-explanatory reasons for Daenerys. But rangers tend to start out very weak. They're thought of as the weakest class in 5th edition. But once getting to 3rd level, i.e. the end of the first book for Daenerys, a powerful dragon ally is born to the ranger, and it grows more powerful as she herself does. This very much culminates in Dany riding her dragons in Book 5, and this is an ability that the Drake Warden Ranger also gets at high levels. I think this really makes sense and can tie into this mystical bond between the Targaryens and their mounted dragons. I think Jon Snow is also a ranger, but this time the Gloomstalker subclass. This shared class between him and Dany reflects their shared heritage, and Jon himself does quite a bit of ranging north of the Wall given his status as a member of the Night's Watch. Gloomstalkers focus on fighting darkness using darkness, which could very much tie into his darker turn in Winds once he's resurrected, if he's resurrected, and if he has that darker turn. That is a bit of a hope from me, but I do like that connection between Jon and Dany through both of them being Rangers. Bran Stark was a bit tricky. In the end, I settled on a multi-class between Sorcerer and Warlock. For the uninitiated, taking levels in more than one different class is called multi-classing. And a Sorcerer is a mage who gains their power through their blood, which ties into the Stark bloodline that Brandon is taking his power from. And a Warlock strikes a deal with some arcane, otherworldly entity to gain magical power, which very much reflects his deals with Bloodraven and the guidance of the Weirwoods. What's more, both of these classes are charisma based, making it a much more likely combination both in actual play and in this particular story. Sansa Stark. There really isn't a politician class in D&D, but man, I wish there was, as I said with Tyrion. But my best instinct would be an Eloquence Bard, which is a subclass of Bard that focuses on oration and weaving magic through words. And that could tie into the warding powers that all of the Stark children have. Some believe that Sansa may use the abilities of her family to subtly influence people politically, and I think that's reflected in this class choice, having access to some levels in magic and being able to influence people that way. I could also see her as a mastermind rogue, taking after her mother and after another character we'll get to in a bit, but I do think that both of these are probably pretty equal possibilities. Arya Stark is likely an assassin rogue, given her typical focus on stealth and on weaponry. There isn't a subclass that grants a rogue face-changing abilities, so I'd say that she'd likely be getting those abilities from a magical item called the Hat of Disguise. Warning if you want to run any D&D games, Hats of Disguise are super overpowered. Do not give them to your players too early in a campaign, but that's neither here nor there. Overall, she is a very deadly combination of having that item and being an assassin. Theon Greyjoy. His weapon of choice tends to be a bow, at least when he has fingers, so I'd lean towards a fighter or a ranger. I actually think I've convinced myself of ranger, and their focus on nature as well could very much tie into the Ironborn's seafaring ways and focus on the natural beauty of the ocean. This could also kind of exemplify the kind of more survivalist abilities that Theon might be able to pick up now that he's not able to be a warrior, whereas if he was a fighter who lost everything, he really wouldn't have much to do. Given Davos's criminal past, I think Rogue definitely fits him pretty well. Rogues can also be great with certain skills, tools, and vehicles, and I think that expertise in watercraft and water vehicles would likely come in handy both as a smuggler and as the one true king's hand. What's more, rogues also tend to be very good at persuasion. I think that's pretty much Davos's main job in the story so far, as we saw both throughout the early books and with Wyman Manderley in A Dance with Dragons. I'm going to talk about Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth at the same time because I think they're very much in the same boat. I think both of them have a pretty good baseline of fighter because, first and foremost, they are strong martial warriors, among the best combatants in Westeros. However, I think on top of that, they are both paladins. They both have tenets of oaths that they have sworn by, and they're crucial parts of both of these characters. Specifically, there's a paladin subclass called the Oathbreaker, which obviously fits Jaime to a T, at least in the early part of his arc, as he's very much leaning into the villain role and wanting to be seen as this evil force. However, starting when he's a point of view character in book 3, I think the Oath of Redemption fits him quite well, which is an oath that people who have done great misdeeds in the past have done to try to improve themselves and improve their place in the world. Brienne, I think, fits into the pretty typical paladin oath of devotion, which is just when you've sworn an oath and you're going to uphold that and generally be good as much as you can. It's pretty much as stereotypically paladin as you can possibly get. I think that the multi-class between the two of them is the best way to approach this, as overall they are not necessarily the most magical as paladins tend to be. They are very focused on fighting, but they do still have those tenets and oaths that they uphold and that are so crucial to their way of life. Also, shout out to Gladys for helping me come up with the multi-class idea for these two. I did appreciate that a lot. I think Sam's probably the best candidate on this list to be a wizard. He's literally about to enroll in magical school, and potentially he's going to learn about glass candles and other forms of magic from the Sphinx and from a faceless man. This class also focuses entirely on intelligence, which fits Sam well, quite Sam well. It also doesn't seem like he dumped Constitution, which is always very good for a wizard, because they need hit points more than anyone else needs hit points. Cersei Lannister is a mastermind rogue who didn't read the rulebook closely enough and decided to dump intelligence despite the fact that it's incredibly important for the class. That said, as a dungeon master, she's exactly the kind of character I love to see in any of my D&D games, just for the sheer amount of chaos and fun she brings to anything that she does. Not intentionally, of course. Arys Oakheart sucks. He'd be an NPC. He shouldn't be a point of view character. Sue me. I'm not putting any more effort into this guy. Arianne Martell is another one I'm adding to the there isn't a diplomat class, so she's a rogue pile. Probably mastermind as well in her attempts to emulate the scheming of her father. Hopefully, she's more successful than his decades of inaction. However, even inaction will be much more successful than Cersei Lannister's attempts at politicking. Areo Hotah, the camera that rides, is quite an interesting one. Took me a while, but I eventually landed on Cleric, which is a divine emissary of a deity, specifically the War Domain subclass. These clerics have a sort of religious bond with their weapons, almost Mandalorian style, and I think that really fits well with Hotah being wed to his axe, which is a really interesting element of his culture that I honestly had kind of forgotten about until I started researching him for this video. He's kind of underrated as a point of view character in my mind. He's not the worst as many people think he is. I think he's near the bottom of the barrel, but he's not Oakheart. He's marginally better. I'll continue subverting expectations here by making Aeron Greyjoy a druid of the Circle of the Land Coast denomination. This ties into his relationship to his faith, as it often seems as though what he thinks is the drowned god speaking to him is actually part of his own subconscious, suppressed due to the trauma he endured as a child that would get this video demonetized that we heard about during the Forsaken chapter. And a druid's ties to nature seem much more fitting to him than a tie to a god as a cleric would have, which seems too generally nice for the drowned god, I'd say. Victarion Greyjoy is the most obvious barbarian on the list. Specifically, I think he falls under the primal path of the Zealot. These warriors use a bit of divine energy in their devotion to a cause or to a god to fuel their rage. And I think this fits super well with Victarion, as he's tied not only to the round god and to the Ironborn, but also to the Lord of Light, thanks to his new and improved microwave hand. It's also worth noting that barbarians can, in fact, wear armor, though many don't. I could see his armor being half plate, which is also still incredibly out of place on board a ship, even though it's not the full plate that I often think it is. Because barbarians can't wear heavy armor, they have to wear medium armor, and half plate is still heavy enough to kill you on a ship, which is, I think, what he's going for. While Asha Greyjoy shares her uncle Victarion's love of axes, I wouldn't say that she's a barbarian. I think that she's a pretty typical fighter, maybe even a champion like Ned. Both of them attempt to make grand political moves, either at the Kingsmoot or in the wake of Bobby V's death, but both don't end up very successful. However, I do very much think that Asha could beat Ned in a fight. If you disagree with me, say why in the comments. I do think she'd beat him in a fight. So there's this ancestry in D&D that are frog people. They're called grung. I think that Quentyn would be a grung. In terms of class, I'd probably say fighter as well, and one that very much dumped charisma based on Dany's reaction to Quentyn. I don't like Quentyn. He makes me ashamed of my name. Melisandre was one of the trickiest decisions on the list. I've gone back and forth between Druid and Cleric a few times, but ultimately I settled on something else entirely. Mel is a Warlock, Pact of the Fiend. This particular subclass gets a wide variety of fire based abilities, and those skills come from a deal that is struck with an otherworldly entity. This fits the nature of Mel's magic better than a cleric, as clerics tend to be far too straightforward for her particular brand of magic and weirdness. We also see in her point of view chapter that she relies on both magical and physical tricks to appear to possess great power. And her relationship to the Lord of Light and the complexities of his power tends to be mirrored directly by warlocks and their pacts. I'd say Barristan Selmy is probably a battle master fighter. I think that his skill with the blade is pretty much undisputed by anybody in the realm, and I think that his role as a Kingsguard is not so much a focus of his arc as it is with Jaime and Brienne. He does swear these oaths, but he is kind of a person who's just trying to do his best by them no matter what. He's not actively trying to uphold certain elements of it in contrast to what had been done before. I think that he fits just being a plain martial warrior better than either Jaime or Brienne would. And last, but certainly not least, you all know my favorite, Jon Con, the best character. I think he'd be a fighter rogue multiclass. I think the fighter part would come from his youth, where he's very headstrong and focused on physical combat. Whereas now that he's returned to the fold and is attempting to be a savvy political player, he's picked up levels in rogue to try to kind of gain this upper hand and cunning that'll hopefully help him and help Aegon take the throne. This shows kind of his development over the years and uses multiclass in a way that I've often had players do as kind of a way to show their character's development in certain directions, as Jon Con is a character who is very actively both developing and decaying. So, what do you think? What characters do you think I was wrong about? Do you think there are any classes I've missed that I should very much have included on this list? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And while you're down there, leave a like, subscribe, all that typical YouTube stuff. If this video does well, maybe I'll do more characters in the series, non-point of view characters, Euron, Stannis, all that. And I'd love to do those. I don't anticipate this doing well because it's kind of more niche than a lot of my recent stuff. But hey, here's hoping. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you all have a good time. And I'm going to see you probably this time next week. Peace.